This is 7th grade logic, chapter 12. Now, in these last few chapters of our textbook, we are studying the 7 rules of validity. And if you remember, a syllogism must follow all 7 rules in order to be valid. The first 2 we covered in the last chapter. They are the terminological rules. They have to do with the terms of the argument. 1, there must be 3 and only 3 terms. 2, the middle term must not occur in the conclusion. Now, the next 2 rules that we cover in this chapter are the quantitative rules. These 2 have to do with the quantity of the statements in the argument. Now, before we get into the rules themselves, let's back up and do a bit of review. Remember, quantity has to do with whether a term is distributed or undistributed. A distributed term refers to all the objects in its class. In other words, all dogs or all humans. A term that is undistributed refers to only some of the objects in its class. So some humans or some dogs. Well, remember that with these categorical syllogisms, we are dealing with only 4 different types of statements. And if you remember a few chapters back, we made a very helpful chart that sets out the distribution for each of the 4 statements. Now, I'm not going to go through all the parts of this chart, but here it is for reference. If you can't find this chart in your notes, then go ahead and copy it down now. Now, I also want to equip you with a new tool for labeling syllogisms. This is just an extra shorthand. If you remember before, we labeled syllogisms with the 3 terms: S, which is the minor term, P, which is the major term, and M, which is the middle term. Well, it's also helpful as you label syllogisms to label each term as either distributed with a lowercase d or undistributed with a lowercase u. Now, with those 2 tools in hand, here is rule number 3. If a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in the premises. Now, this rule keeps us from saying more in the conclusion than the premises allow. If I say something about some things, well, I can't then take that statement and use it to say something about all things. That is going further than my first statement does. Here's an example. All angels are spiritual beings. No humans are angels. Therefore, no humans are spiritual beings. Now, notice here that spiritual beings is distributed in the conclusion and undistributed in the first premise. This leaves a gap. I can't get from the premises to the conclusion. It's too far of a leap. This particular syllogism is an example of the fallacy of the illicit major. Illicit means illegal, and if you remember from the last chapter, fallacy means flaw in reasoning. The fallacy of illicit major is when the major term, P, breaks rule 3 by being distributed in the conclusion but not in the premises. Now consider another example that also breaks the rule but in a different way. All humans are animals. All humans are mortal. Therefore, all mortals are animals. Well, here our subject term is mortals, and it's distributed, but the predicate term animals is undistributed. Now look in the premises. Here's our P term, animals. That's undistributed, but that's okay because it was undistributed in the conclusion. But look at the second premise. S here is undistributed. So here the S term, the minor term, is distributed in the conclusion but undistributed in the premises. Therefore, this syllogism also breaks rule number 3. And this is an example of the fallacy of the illicit minor, meaning the minor term, or S, breaks rule 3 by being distributed in the conclusion but not in the premises. And both of these fallacies, these logical mistakes, are variations of what we call the fallacy of illicit process, meaning any way of breaking Rule 3 is an illicit or illegal, not allowed process. Now, finally, we get to Rule 4. Rule 4 is the middle term must be distributed at least once. Now, to get your head around this one, imagine we are sharing a pie, you and I. Now, I have one slice and you have another. Now, we can certainly say that my slice is pie and your slice is pie. Both true. Our slices have that in common, right? But I can't necessarily say that my slice includes your slice. It might be true if I'm greedy, but I can't get there from the premises. And so this is the problem. We'd be committing the fallacy of the undistributed middle, when the middle term breaks Rule 4 by not being distributed at least once. In that silly example, the middle term would be pie. My slice is pie, your slice is pie, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an overlap between my slice and your slice. So, to sum up, the rules of validity that we've encountered so far are 1, there must be 3 and only 3 terms. 2, the middle term must not occur in the conclusion. 3, if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in the premises. And this one can be broken in one of 2 ways, the fallacy of illicit major and the fallacy of illicit minor. And Rule 4, the middle term must be distributed at least once. If we break this rule, we're committing the fallacy of the undistributed middle. Happy studying.